Dave wants to know, Dr. Osborne, what do you feed your children for breakfast? Well, great question, Dave. I don't have any kids nowadays. My youngest is actually 18, graduated from high school, but I can certainly share with you most mornings what he's eating are eggs and typically eggs and fruit are a major staple for breakfast for my kids. So if you're talking about, during the school year, usually parents want to feed their kids as they're going off to school because they won't have an opportunity to eat for quite a long time. So eggs is an option. We also make a homemade sausage out of, you can make it out of bison, you can also make it out of beef. And, we use herbs and spices to basically to give it good flavor. And then we put it in a pan, and it's not a frying that we do with it. We just put it in the water and we simmer heat it until it's done. And that also is sometimes what we'll cook as a breakfast food. So if you're trying to kind of keep the ideology around what a traditional breakfast might seem like, many of you get fixated or stuck on breakfast being breakfast, like cereal, toast, eggs, ham, that kind of stuff. Well, breakfast sausage or eggs are what are considered for most to be traditional breakfast foods. So those are just a couple of ideas that you can do. Another question, what's a good children's probiotic? Well, I have something, it's a probiotic we have. It's a powdered version of probiotic. You can find that on Gluten Free Society. It's called Biotic Defense. And it's perfectly safe for children. Okay, let's see here. Yeah, so I find that commentary quite interesting. Karen says, Karen in the red zone in Pennsylvania went to Home Depot and Whole Foods without a mask and no one said a word. That, going back to what we were talking about earlier, that's kind of another contradiction of what we've heard, is that everybody wanted us to wear masks and social distance. And if you really want to get into some of the reasons why I think the mask issue was pushed forward to such a great degree without really any great science to back it, is because I think there's a hidden agenda. I think that the masks allow for people to not protest, but to riot, and the identities not to be known, because there's now evidence coming to light that these riots have been planned for even longer than the death of George, of George Floyd, who was murdered. Even before that, these riots, there's some evidence showing that these things were planned well in advance. Almost makes you even question the death itself, and I don't want to get into that tonight, because we can go down a rabbit hole that I don't think some of you want to go down, and that's just not my expertise either. I'm not a private investigator that I want to go down that rabbit hole. So Melanie wants to know, can you test for cortisol? Yes, you can. Cortisol can be tested, and really if you're under chronic stress and you can't figure out why you're tired, you wake up super exhausted, you should test for cortisol. Cortisol is a circadian hormone, meaning it changes based on the time of the day. So generally speaking, cortisol in the early morning is very high, and as later morning, noon approaches, the cortisol levels drop, and then as the afternoon approaches, they drop a little bit more, and then as night approaches, it drops a little bit more. So cortisol kind of follows almost like an L-shaped curve, more of a U-ish L-shaped curve over the course of the day, and you should have it checked. If you're going to try to get an accurate assessment of what your circadian cortisol pattern is, you should have it checked at all 4 different times. So somewhere upon waking, then have it checked again around noon, have it checked again around 4 p.m., and then have it checked again before bedtime. Proper way to check cortisol. And some doctors will draw it in the blood. It's a little bit more challenging to do cortisol because you got to get your blood drawn 4 days. Not 4 days, but at 4 different time points in a day, which is a little bit onerous. Or some doctors will actually measure cortisol in the saliva, which is an accurate representation, an accurate way to look at it. Elizabeth wants to know, can I comment on rheumatoid arthritis? Can it be reversed? Oh, great question, Elizabeth, and I'm a little biased here. If you don't know this, I wrote a book published by Simon & Schuster, national and international bestseller, called No Grain, No Pain. And, the very first chapter, you can read some testimony in the book. You can read some actual stories of, patients with rheumatoid arthritis who put it in remission without medication. So to answer your question, yes, it can be reversed. And it's a big premise of why I do what I do is because of rheumatoid arthritis is actually what got me going down the path and looking at functional medicine in a much bigger way. So yes, it can be reversed. Let's see here. Is sugar in fruit bad when you're fighting sugar addiction? Not necessarily, but it can be. Depends. It's a quantity issue. It's not that fruit sugar is necessarily bad or evil, because it's not, but it's a quantity issue. For example, you know, when you buy the grapes in the store, you don't eat the whole bunch. You don't eat a pound of grapes. It's, you know, it's kind of a serving size. A quarter cup would be considered a decent serving size of that. And so most people don't stop at that quantity, and they end up eating, you know, a half a pound of grapes, and it's the quantity. So it's a quantity issue, not necessarily that fruit sugar is bad. Generally, when I'm teasing somebody down and away from sugar, we try to keep their quantities to about 1.5 cups of total fruit per day, and we remove any kind of dried fruit. So there would be no, you know, for example, dried mangoes or raisins or dried cherries or those types of things that are going to be much more concentrated in sugar because they're dehydrated, and what's left as the water is pulled out, what you have left are very, very small pieces of dried fruit. And again, generally people tend to way overeat those, and you can eat a lot of sugar eating dried fruit. How to stop emotional eating? I've gained weight since the lockdown. Penny wants to know. So emotional eating is one of those things that if you've got, you know, you've got to identify that emotion that's your trigger. What is your trigger emotion? And first recognizing what that trigger emotion is a very important part of how to stop emotional eating. So once you can kind of understand that, you can understand what that trigger emotion is, then you can, you know, reverse engineer what are the triggers that get you into the mindset of having that emotion. That really is one of the most effective ways to stop, you know, the psychological component to overeating. But that's where I would begin. Start with what is the emotion, and secondarily start with what is the trigger to that emotion that makes you feel that way, and then start working backwards and removing the trigger to that emotion the best that you can. And then secondary to that, you can also add in, if that emotion comes in, because we don't necessarily want to block our emotions. Our emotions are an outlet so that we don't like kill each other right at the end of the day. You want to create new habits around that emotion. So recognizing what that trigger is so that you can create a new habit around when you're feeling that way. Jean says, Dr. Osborne, you don't look old enough for an 18-year-old child. Yeah, my oldest son is actually much older. He's 25. So yeah, I've got, my oldest is 25. So yeah, I don't. It's because, Jean, I practice what I preach, and that's what I want for all of you as well. Karen wants to know, can taking collagen cause anxiety? Generally, not typically, no. Collagen what I have seen collagen do is it doesn't necessarily trigger anxiety, you know, because of a chemical in it, but it can for many people. Collagen is too thick, it's too hard for them to digest, and so it triggers stress on the GI tract, which then can stimulate a vagal nerve to create an anxiety type of response. So chemically speaking, no, but if collagen is difficult for you to digest, I've seen that be the case in some people, and that's not a common thing. And what some people will have to do is water down the collagen so that it's not quite as thick, so that it's easier, a little bit easier on the digestive tract, especially those of you who are struggling with chronic digestive disorders and you've heard or read something about how good collagen is for you, and you've started to take it as a regular supplement. For some people, that's just not a good idea. It can actually backfire. Barbara wants to know, are IV vitamins better than oral capsules? No, they're not. I would say if you can avoid IV, avoid IV. Now, if you're so malnourished and your GI tract is in such disrepair, then, you know, sometimes IV is a solution. But remember, your gut and your gut properly functioning, whether it's supplements or food, should be the main mechanism by which you try to achieve your nutrition adequacy. You don't want to rely on a IV bag or having to get injections, because again, that's not that your GI tract, if it's functioning, if it's working, you shouldn't require those first and foremost. I like this comment. A nation of sheep will soon have a government of wolves. I couldn't agree with you more. That's why I'm very concerned about what's going on right now with the curfews and the shutdowns and the mask wearing and all the other nonsense that, again, that a very intentional media has deliberately lied to us and insinuated and you know, basically stoked the fires of fear during this time. So, Sarah, I have celiac. When I'm out walking, my eyes start burning. Fumes from restaurants, I think because they're cooking wheat. I'm outside and never go inside, but I still react. I'm grain-free. Help. You know, it's hard to say. You may have some other issues, Sarah. Even if you're grain-free, I mean, you could have external allergens of things that are outside and not necessarily the restaurant. But of course, if it doesn't happen unless you're walking by the burning fumes of a restaurant, you know, that's a little different matter. Now, one of the things you might attempt to do, there's a supplement that can support your allergic response called Histocyst, and that can help support your mast cells so they don't break open, releasing the histamine, causing the itchiness or the other symptoms typically associated with exposure. So that might be beneficial or helpful for you, and you might give that a try. Outside of that, avoid walking, you know, in those areas. And sometimes that, I realize that can be hard to do. Brenda says, my apolipoprotein B is 154 and lipoprotein A is 469. How concerned should I be? So there's not a whole lot you can do about lipoprotein A. If it's 469, I mean, I have seen two things that can lower lipoprotein A. Now, that being said, why do we want to lower it? Some believe it's a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. In all of my experience with lipoprotein A, generally speaking, I've never seen somebody die from a heart attack because they had lipoprotein A elevations. Typically, people that have heart attack or stroke or other cardiovascular events, it has a lot more to do with their lifestyle and their choices and their diet, and their behavior is highly inflammatory. And so lipoprotein A is not independently going to be the thing that creates that problem for them. That being said, two things I've seen lower lipoprotein A. One is vitamin C. It doesn't do it in everybody, but I have seen it lower it. Although, you know, again, if you're at 169, it's not going to lower it substantially enough. I mean, 10 grams a day, you might get a 15-point reduction. The other is a carnivore diet. I've seen carnivore diets actually reduce people's lipoprotein A, and that's kind of a more aggressive diet. It's not something I recommend that people do, you know, on a consistent, regular basis for the rest of their lives. Some people, especially people that have severe digestive problems as it relates to eating fruits and vegetables and FODMAPs, can do well for a time on a carnivore-based type diet, minimizing fruits and vegetables for a time as their GI tract makes a recovery. But it's just not a diet I would recommend, you know, lifelong to follow in the name of lowering lipoprotein A. Dazzle Me Red says, what's the name of the book again? It's No Grain, No Pain. I think we can probably throw a link up. You can pick it up on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or any other major book carrier, but nograinnopainbook.com. If you order it off that site and leave us your receipt number, we'll send you a free gift. So if you're going to order it, go ahead and get the free gift while you're at it, right? Let's see. Margie says, I use a body lotion with oat kernel flour in it. Am I glutened from it? Hard to say. I don't recommend people with a known history of celiac or gluten sensitivity use products that contain oat. There's research studies that show oats can be just as inflammatory, even though the FDA will allow the labeling of oats to be gluten-free. But remember, your skin's an organ. It digests and absorbs, you know, in a sense digests. It absorbs things from the lotion. And so some doctors would argue that the particle or the Dalton size of the molecule is too big to penetrate through the skin. I would argue that if you've got poor health and you have a leaky or a poor skin barrier, then those particles, just like with a leaky gut, are going to penetrate and get through into your bloodstream and potentially create problems. So it's just not something I would recommend. Can a typhoid infection cause leaky gut? Yes, any type of infection can trigger intestinal hyperpermeability or leaky gut. So the answer to that, pretty simply, yes. Paige wants to know, in order for me to exercise more, I need my joints to be healthier. What can I take other than turmeric, glucosamine, and chondroitin with MSM? So that's kind of so you need your joints to be healthier. So I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. If maybe you mean that when you try to exercise, your joints hurt and there's a kind of a pain issue that occurs. So one of the things I would suggest, if it's a pain, then there are a couple things you can do. Actually, I would do them concomitantly together. Number one is 5 grams of vitamin C. Number two is 4 to 6 grams of quercetin. And what I would recommend is a product called Detox C that I recommend, along with another product called Ultra Q that would give you those higher doses to help support that inflammatory response and to support that joint health for you. The other thing, Paige, that you might want to consider, again, is working directly with the doctor. A doctor can measure your vitamin mineral levels because it's possible you could have, like, for example, a zinc deficiency and not know it, magnesium deficiency and not know it. These minerals are important for joint integrity and joint function, and you may not be getting enough. And those are just examples. I mean, there are 40 different essential nutrients. So having a doctor who's thorough and can test you for those things is important. Many of you have asked me, I get this all the time. Dr. Osborne, I didn't realize that you still saw people. I'm never going to quit seeing people. It's actually one of my it's part of how I feel I can maintain my integrity is to continue to practice, because if I don't practice, then I stop learning. And a doctor, once they quit practice and they're just reading literature and just reading research and reporting on information, they somewhat lose their in the trenches. They don't lose their past experience, but they lose sight on updates and new things that might change or things that might come along, and so they kind of lose an advantage, in my opinion. So it's something that I never intend on stopping in the future. Let's see. So Donna says, you mentioned that we should try to get our nutrition through our digestive system. What about B12? My mom's doctor wants to start taking B12 in a pill. Would it be better to get a sublingual? So the great thing about a sublingual, Donna, is that it works both ways. Is you get some through the cheeks, which is part of your GI tract. Remember, your GI tract is the tube from your mouth to your anus. So sublingual is probably going to be better absorbed if your mother has any type of history of gastrointestinal dysfunction or problems. And most elderly people do, because they're on multiple medications that impact their stomach acid or impact their digestive enzyme secretion, or that cause leaky gut or some other type of damage. I mean, just look at most of your blood pressure medications damage the GI tract. Steroids damage the GI tract. Pain medications damage the GI tract. Cholesterol medications damage the GI tract. So, again, a lot of your common used meds impact the GI tract and its capacity to digest and absorb. And a lot of common meds also, too, will cause the vitamin B12 deficiency. Like, for example, I don't know if you guys saw this recently, metformin being recalled on the market right now. There's 4 different manufacturers of metformin. It's being recalled because of some type of contamination issues. But that particular drug is used for diabetics to control blood sugar, and it depletes vitamin B12. So again, sublingual is a better way to go because you go right into the cheeks to the bloodstream. Now, that being said, a pill can be effective if you've got a healthy GI tract as well. B12 being high, if you're talking about serum B12 levels, they're not worth the paper they're printed on, so I wouldn't use serum B12 as a measure for accurately assessing vitamin B12 levels. If you're referring to intracellular vitamin B12, that's a different matter. But most people, I should say many doctors, I mean, if we look at all the doctors in the world, how many of them are actually board certified to practice nutrition clinically? There are probably 365, 370 at last count, myself being one of them. It's a board specialty that very few doctors pursue because nutrition is not It's not a sexy profession. It's considered kind of, well, think about what nutrition is called in college. In college 101 classes, nutrition is referred to as home economics. Not too sexy for doctors, for people that are training to go on to get a doctorate degree. So, it just doesn't have that high profile that some of the other specialties do. So, but finding a doc that can measure those things might help you quite a bit ascertain whether your B12 is actually high or whether your B12 in your serum is high, which is misleading. Let's see, Bonnie wants to know, Dr. Osborne, are there people that should not take Immune Shield? Not really. I mean, again, it becomes a why do you want to take it type of an issue. It has a purpose and a function. And so are there people that shouldn't take it? People that don't need it predominantly. But that's pretty much it. I would say, what is the need? If you've got a history of low antibody production or low immune system function, low white counts, Immune Shield is designed to help support your immune system so that as you're eating, the things that you're eating, even remember, every time you eat, there's good and bad, and even in good foods, there are bad things. And so the job of your gut is to act as a quarantine zone so that it can extrapolate the good from the bad, and you can poop out the bad. And some of you don't have adequate quantities of mucosal antibodies being produced, and that's really what Immune Shield was designed to do. It was designed to help kind of support your immunity in your GI tract if you're trying to come back from, from years of GI problems, especially those of you that have that history of gluten sensitivity, just learning about it and trying to make those diet changes. Let's see here. Yeah, it's a sad state of affairs. Jean says, I have given up on going to any doctor where I am, nothing but the allopathic docs. I haven't been to a regular doctor for 4 years. Far be it from me to tell any of you not to go see a doctor, but fundamentally, the way I see it, the problem with the vast majority of doctors is really very few of them want to actually listen to you. Very few of them will listen to you. The vast majority of them, I call it pseudo-compassion. They, under the guise of compassion, and I don't think it's pseudo-compassion to them. I think they truly are trying to be compassionate. I call it pseudo-compassion because it's really false compassion. When you rob somebody of their ability to interpret their body's messaging in the sake of appeasing their pain or appeasing their discomfort without teaching them why the discomfort exists in the first place, it's not compassionate at all. That's why I call it pseudo-compassion. It's masking the problem. It's duct taping the pipe in hopes that the water won't flood your floor, but it's not really fixing the pipe itself. That's the core issue in allopathy. Let's see. Do you think escaping? Oh, does it look like we lost the comment there? Okay. How do you know? It's a classic question. Matt says, how do you know if you're gluten intolerant? Genetic testing. And the better way to say it, Matt, and this is not me trying to pick on you at all. This is just, I want there to be clarity. It's not really gluten intolerance. It's gluten sensitivity. And the definitions are different, and they do matter. But the best way to know whether or not you're going to react to gluten when you're consuming it is to have genetic testing done. You can ask your doctor for genetic testing in that regard. Again, many doctors won't run it. If you can't get your doctor to run it, you can certainly go to glutenfreesociety.org, our foundation, and you can get access to genetic testing to help you to determine that. There's also on glutenfreesociety.org, and I don't know if we have that link we can put up now for our quiz. We have a quiz that you can take. Now, this quiz, it's a handful of questions that you can answer yes or no to about symptoms that you're having. And it's not going to be definitive. So it's not going to be definitive to say, oh, yes, you are definitely gluten sensitive. But it might steer you down the track as to whether or not going further and doing genetic testing would be the right move. Now, those of you who've been following a gluten-free diet for years and your health and your symptoms are relatively okay, taking this quiz doesn't do you much good, because if you take the quiz but you're already gluten-free and you're experiencing the benefits of gluten-free, then you're probably going to find that the quiz gives you a false negative result, not because you're not gluten sensitive, but because you're not eating gluten and experiencing the symptoms that gluten might cause you to have, which are the questions that we ask within the quiz. Let's see. Sarah says, I had a gastroenterologist tell me I was nuts. He told me all my problems were caused by my thoughts. You know, that's a classic, right? You know, the doctor projects their inadequacy on you because they don't want to spend the time to help you, or they don't have the knowledge to be able to assess and help you in the way that you need. Again, most traditional doctors are, you know, it's see nail, use hammer. It's a kind of one-size-fits-all approach. Everything that comes through the door, unfortunately, is a nail. And the only tool in their tool belt is a hammer. Actually, a hammer and a mallet, maybe, because surgery and drugs, those are the two primary tools that most doctors use. And again, if surgery or medicine is an appropriate thing to do for a person, it's one thing. But, you know, the only drug I know of to date, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the only drug that I know that cures any disease is an antibiotic. It actually cures the infection if you have a bacterial infection. It can, and it can save your life. But the vast majority of pretty much every other pharmaceutical is designed for symptom management. That's not a cure, and it's not addressing the real reason that you have your problem. Let's see, can alopecia areata be reversed? Kira wants to know. Kira, go check out, if you go check out our YouTube channel, actually have a case study that I think would interest you quite a bit, of a person over a year's period of time, a woman that came to see me. And when she first came to see me, she had massive hair loss on her scalp. And, you know, within 6 months, she had about 40% regrowth. And within about a year, she had about 95% regrowth. So to answer your question, yes, alopecia areata can be reversed. Now, what I have seen that I've seen where people started regrowing hair, but somebody with a full head that's completely bald, the alopecia areata has damaged them to such an extent where they're completely bald, and they've been so for a number of years. In those types of cases where the skin has completely lost its hair follicle, I haven't seen that be reversed. But if you've got, you know, patches, nummular, round patches of hair loss, yes, those can come back. Those can grow back. You don't have to inject your scalp with steroids, which is the standard of care in today's world. Let's see. Somebody's asking me if I follow Q. If you mean quercetin, I follow the research on quercetin, but no, if you're talking about Q, you know, the unknown, what many people consider to be conspiracy theorists, no, not really. I follow my heart, and I follow my own intelligent, logical observations about the world. Generally, it's, you know, that's what I try to do, and that's what I encourage all of you to do. Do you offer food sensitivity testing too? Deandra wants to know. Yeah, so for food sensitivity testing, it's a little bit more advanced, Deandra. At this time, currently, we only do that when somebody comes in as a client. We don't do that as a service to the world. We're actually investigating the potential legally to maybe bring that out so that people can have greater degrees of access to it. But at this point, I don't want you to hold your breath. I don't want to promise anything because it's too soon to know. Let's see here. Can glucosamine supplements help with joint pain so it's easier to exercise? Yeah, they can. Glucosamine, there's some really good research on glucosamine for some people. It can be very effective. I would say if you're going to take glucosamine, combine it with MSM. And if you're looking for a good version of that, you can check out Ultra Joint. It's got glucosamine, chondroitin, and MSM in it as a combination. I like that. Linda says, I eat salmon, avocado, and veggies for breakfast. So going back to one of the first questions that was asked, it's just another feedback for you. Thanks, Linda, for sharing that. And anyone else who has a breakfast idea they want to share with Dave, just, you know, type it in. I'm sure Dave would be happy to see those ideas. Christy wants to know, you briefly mentioned yeast overgrowth. Do you have any tips for yeast in the throat for adults? The number one thing that you have to do, Christy, in yeast overgrowth is identify the origin or the source. So many people try to do yeast detoxes. They try to take products, but they don't identify the source of the yeast and where it's coming from, or why the immune system is so weak that it allowed yeast to overgrow. Remember, we all have yeast in our GI tract. There's actually something, we've all heard of the term microbiome, but very few people really talk about what's known as the mycobiome. Myco refers to the yeast, and you have a microbiome, and it's when you have an aggressive overgrowth that it can become a problem. So it's not that we're all shooting and aiming for zero yeast. We're shooting for adequate normalization of our microbiome, just like we don't want bacterial growing out of control. Some of those bacteria are known to create major problems and trigger autoimmune disease. Same thing with yeast or fungus. So you got to find out where the source is coming from. So going back to that, for a lot of people, it's the alcohol, it's the sugar, it's the diet, it's the gluten suppressing their immune system, not giving them the capacity to fight, or it's chronic antibiotic use, or it's drinking water that's not properly filtered, or it's drinking water with a lot of chlorine and fluoride because those act as antibiotics on the GI tract, suppressing bacterial growth, allowing for fungal overgrowth to occur. So there are a number of different things. If you want to learn a little bit more in depth about that topic, I've got a video on that you can check out on our media archive channel, and it's all about yeast overgrowth, and you can check that out in a little bit more detail. Pamela says, I do all the things you say, do not lose weight, not stressed, and sleep fairly well most nights. So if you're doing everything right, Pamela, you might have an undisclosed food allergen that's driving your biochemical stress. So driving this biochemically, not necessarily emotional stress, but biochemical stress, or a chemical exposure in some of the things that you're getting exposed to. It's also possible that you have an environmental issue that's creating, from the outside in, that's creating an inflammation. Some people living in chronic mold have that issue. And it's also possible you're just overeating calories. A lot of people that go on the no grain, no pain diet, it can be easier to overdo the fat. And so if you start overdoing the fat, what can end up happening is you get into trouble with your total caloric load. And so even if you're exercising and doing everything else right, you might just be eating too many calories. So a good place to start too is just by counting your macronutrients and making sure that you're, again, I'm going to assume you're a woman, but without knowing your height, age, or weight, it's hard really to judge. But, I'll give you an example. A woman who's, 5'3", 5'4", weighs 120 pounds, kind of as a normal, if they're eating 1,600, 1,700 calories a day, they're not going to lose weight if they're trying to, because it's too much for their height and weight. It's a caloric overload issue. So sometimes it's a matter of just the old-fashioned counting calories, although that doesn't work if you haven't dialed in your diet, if you don't sleep, if you're not doing healthy things. Counting calories is going to work less effectively for you. But if you're doing everything that I talk about and still not losing weight, that may be part of the issue. Let's see here. Hi, Cher says, hi, I love your show. Thanks, Cher. Is there something that can be done for recurrent MRSA infections? I'm constantly given antibiotics and don't want to keep taking them. So the first thing I would ask your doctor is, okay, if you're having a MRSA infection, what are the symptoms? So like, what is the ramification, the manifestation of the MRSA infection? Or is it just something that was randomly found on a lab test? Because a person can have the growth of methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. In essence, you can have Staph aureus in your body. I see it all the time in people that don't have active infections. So are they treating it prophylactically because it's there? Or are they treating it because you're having symptoms? And so that would be the number one question, because if they're treating it and you're not really symptomatic, then you have to reevaluate why they're actually treating it. So we're running down on the time and the questions aren't stopping. Love all the recipe ideas that are coming in. Keep going here. We'll take one or two more. Can cortisol from chronic stress stall weight loss even if someone is following a keto diet? Sure it can. The cortisol is the ruiner of weight loss. It is the absolute ruiner. If you want to guarantee an ineffective weight loss program, put somebody under too much stress and drive up their cortisol. Guaranteed to stop weight loss. And this is why a lot of people go on these programs, these calorie-restricted diets. They're initially successful, but then it fails, because one way that you can elevate cortisol is by over-restricting your calories. So again, a calorie restriction diet can actually lead to the chronic stress that leads to the weight gain. And you can't maintain a calorie-restricted diet forever. It's just not healthy, nor is it something that you should attempt at doing. Okay, last question here. How dangerous is zinc oxide? It's not dangerous. Zinc oxide's not dangerous, Chucho. It's just not effective. Zinc oxide is not very well absorbed. So as a form of zinc, its bioavailability is very poor. So you have to take a lot more zinc oxide to get the same amount of zinc that you would use if you were using like a zinc citrate or a zinc picolinate. It's just your body doesn't recognize zinc oxide as well. So again, it's not dangerous. If you're talking about oral. Now, if you're talking about sunscreen, is it dangerous? There's some sunscreens contain a zinc oxide. Not dangerous, perfectly fine to use. All right, folks, we've hit the wall on time. Look, if you are new to the show, if this is your first exposure to Big Dr. Osborne's Brain, come back and join us every Monday, 6 p.m. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and go pick up some freebies from me. If you visit my foundation, glutenfreesociety.org, sign up for our newsletter. It's the world's largest, #1 gluten-free newsletter, and you'll get some freebies when you sign up for that, and we'll send you weekly reminders and a newsletter that will help keep you updated on healthy diet and lifestyle as you're trying to navigate any type of health issue that you might be struggling with. So again, thanks for joining me on Monday night. Thanks for spending your time with me. Hope everybody out there stays safe and focuses on what needs to be focused on. Don't buy into the hype. Don't buy into the hate. The media wants you all to hate each other. Don't buy into it. Hug your neighbor, love your neighbor, take your mask off. Remember, the CDC now has even admitted the lie that the mortality rate of COVID-19 is more like 0.26, which is less than influenza, by the way. So now we know this thing, you don't wear a mask for a cold and flu season. Don't wear a mask. Don't suffer yourself and suffocate yourself and create the ability for protesters mimicking protesters to riot anonymously, because that's really what I think. Anyway, we won't go there. That's what I think a lot of this is about. We're going to end the show. Have a great week. We'll see you next Monday night. Hey, if you've got a functional medicine or health question that you'd like me to answer for you, make sure you send me an email, glutenology@gmail.com, and we'll do our best to create a video answer just for you. Have a great day.